And we often feel like in more progressive communities where there is a lot of support for LGBTQIA people, which is great. But when someone comes out of the closet, it's often congratulations, you're so brave, we're so proud of you, you're amazing for coming out. And the straight spouse is just like, or the cisgender spouse is like, what about me? I mean, my whole existence just imploded in a puff of smoke, and I'm not even sure if my marriage was real. Was any of it a lie? Was it a fraud? Was I a beard? Was I just a bit of set dressing? So there's a whole questioning that happens in secret and a grappling with the feelings of either shame or anger or even rage. If you feel like your whole life has been commandeered for someone else's show, and none of those feelings necessarily have anything to do with homophobia.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and I came out as a lesbian shortly after my 60th birthday in 2015. One of the things that those of us coming out later in life have in common is the challenge of finding community. And since I've been hosting 2 other podcasts since 2006, starting a podcast seemed like a logical next step. Before I tell you about this month's guest, I want to mention that you can find more episodes of Graying Rainbows along with episode show notes on our website, grayingrainbows.com. You can send me feedback at grayingrainbows@gmail.com or submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. You can also post comments on the Graying Rainbows Facebook fan page. We also have a private Facebook group, which I'll tell you about after the interview. Today's guest is Kristin Kalbli from the Straight Spouse Voices Network podcast. I have to admit that when Kristin was first recommended as a guest, I wasn't sure it was a good idea. But I learned so much from talking to Kristin that I really want to encourage you to listen wherever you happen to be on your journey. It's great to welcome you on the show, Kristin.
Thank you so much, Ginger. It's a pleasure to be here.
Would you like to start out just by telling us a little bit about your story?
Absolutely. So I met my ex-husband in the early 90s when I was a high school student. We actually did theater together in my junior year of high school. Didn't know each other very well, but I saw him across the room sitting down at the piano, and I thought he was cute. He was a rehearsal pianist. So we were both involved in theater, and we didn't start dating until we were in college. We went to school together. He was a year ahead of me, and that's when we started dating. And, you know, some interesting things happened when we were in college. We had some interesting conversations around that time that I kind of forgot about and didn't really remember until much later in our marriage, or actually after our divorce. But one of which was he had a gay roommate who was out at college. And he told me, he said, you know, when he found out his roommate was gay, he went in the bathroom and vomited. And I thought that was a little intense because we were around theater kids all the time and half of us were gay and no big deal. And our friends were coming out of the closet all the time. So I asked him, I said, you know, that's a really intense reaction. You know, why did you go in the bathroom and vomit? And he said, well, I thought that might mean my roommate being gay. I thought that might mean that I was gay. And I kind of thought, well, one does not necessarily have a bearing on the other, but okay. And I said, so are you gay? And he said, because I was like, well, if you're gay, no big deal. We just don't date anymore. And he said, no, I figured out that's not what I want. And I was 19 and it pinged me at the time, but it didn't really register, you know? And at the time I was like, he says, no, he's not gay. No, he's not gay. I'm going to take you at face value. So, and the other conversation we had that I think is important for the context is the other thing he'd said to me at one point before I think we were engaged at this point. And now he was talking about that same roommate. And he said to me, my roommate wants to get married and have kids. And this was in the early 90s. Marriage equality was not a thing. So I was kind of puzzled. And then I realized he was talking about getting married to a woman and having kids. And I said to my then fiance, I said, that's not okay. I said, he's not allowed to marry. What I literally said was, he's not allowed to dupe some woman into marrying him so that he can have a wife and kids. And inside my head, I said to myself, that poor woman, she has no idea what's going to hit her. I forgot that for a lot of years, but it came back to me, and it'll come into play in a minute. So we marry, and we have a very, what I thought was intellectually compatible and enjoyable relationship, and a sexually incredibly frustrating and unfulfilling relationship. I was at a loss to figure out why we could not connect sexually. And when I would bring the topic of the bedroom up, I was met with a lot of silence, the grand wall of silence, kind of. I kind of banged my head against a wall for a lot of years and didn't really know how it was wearing me down, how it was really wearing on me. And I remember saying to him at one point, I feel like we're just roommates. We're just brother and sister. We're just platonic. And this is heartbreaking to me. And no real answer for that. And I asked him for couples counseling and to even go to the doctor. Let's get testosterone checked. Let's get everything checked, all that kind of stuff. And nothing made a difference until I was an actor in Atlanta, and I was in a show, and a very, very sexy man became my co-star in this particular play. And I said, "Oh, like, what is this?" I was gobsmacked by how attracted to this man I was. And it highlighted for me what was absent in my marriage. So one night, the big confrontation happened. We had sex, and I turned over and kind of cheekily, I said to him, so tell me what you fantasize about. I won't get explicit. But he immediately shot bolt upright out of bed and said, do not ask me that. It was mean, and it was a deadly command, and it was like a threat. And it just came out of my mouth. I said, are you gay? And the look on his face, he just went white, and he said, why? And I said, if you're gay, you owe it to me to let me out of this marriage. And then he said, do you want out of this marriage? And then I said, if you're gay, yes. And then he said, I'm not gay. So at this point, I didn't have a lot of faith in that answer. I didn't know what to believe, if he was telling me the truth. I was trying to take him still at face value. But what happened within the following days was that I said, well, I'm separating from you, and I'm going to date other people, and all that entails. In other words, fair warning, I'm about to go have sex with this really hot actor. And that was really a revelation, Ginger. He wasn't a particularly good lover, but he was an enthusiastic lover. And I almost didn't know what to make of it. I went to, my ex and I were from Midwestern Catholic families and states. And, we weren't virgins when we married, but I hadn't been with anybody before him. So I didn't have anything to compare it to. And so I really added this layer of sleeping with a heterosexual man who was very enthusiastic about sex. And it actually added to my confusion in some ways. It cleared some things, but it added confusion in other ways. So we were still separated. We went into marital counseling together to try to figure out if we could save the marriage. And of course, I told him in marital counseling that I had been with someone else during that time. And at that point, his personality really changed. He did a 180 in the bedroom, and all of a sudden started pulling out all the stops, trying to be the ultimate sort of heterosexual lover. But unfortunately, by that time, I was done. So the marriage ended rather brutally, with a lot of punishment and a lot of, I was locked out of the house, which was no fun. It was a really messy divorce. And fast forward, so we divorced. Our divorce was final in December of 2007. And in 2015, I get a message on Facebook from a woman who I knew to be his second wife, the woman he married after me. And I only really knew that because I had a bunch of good girlfriends who kind of stalked him for a little while on social media. I was like, I don't really want to know. I need to move on. And they were like, no, we need to find out. I got a message from her, and she said, you don't know who I am, but I married him after you, and we're divorcing. And I'm wondering, would you be willing to talk to me? And I had to really think about it. And I hadn't answered her back for a couple of days. I was just really torn. And she sent me another message and said, I'm struggling to figure out how I didn't know things. I'm not sure if this man is the man I married. And I was like, whoa, what is this? And then she followed up with one more message and she said, Kristin, he's gay. That was the thing that led me to connect with her. And so we spoke on the phone, and then we ended up meeting in person over several months and comparing notes and comparing our stories, and come to find out that he did eventually come out to her on cue cards, which was a bit of a devastating experience for her. And that he had been with several dozen men by the time he'd informed her that he was gay and that he was leaving her and he wanted her to move out of the house right away. And so it all accelerated at a very rapid pace. And she was still trying to wrap her brain around just the disclosure piece. And he was pushing very rapidly for divorce while she was still going, wait a minute, what? She was still trying to figure out if she could save the marriage at the time, which, some of us end up in a space of denial where we think we can save the marriage or we might want to save the marriage. That clarity has not arrived yet. And unfortunately, it was really rough for her. She found some things that ultimately pointed towards his activities that eventually led her to have that clarity. Okay, this marriage is not salvageable. And so they divorced. And so I've always been grateful to her for giving me the truth and that clarity, because in the interim, post-divorce and before she came into my life, I really wondered how I had failed. I really wondered how I had managed what I had done so horribly wrong in the marriage. And that was what the narrative was, quite frankly. While we were divorcing, I was in a terrible depression. And when I had informed my ex-husband that I had been with someone else, there was a narrative put forward to family and friends that I was an adulteress, and the divorce was, a fault divorce for infidelity. And so I had this big old scarlet A on my chest, and I wore, a lot of shame around everywhere because our friends and family and our dentist knew that I, quote unquote, cheated on him. So it was very, very messy. And I always am grateful to his second wife for giving me the truth so that I could finally know that, wow, okay, that was not about me. And then I remembered that conversation that we'd had about his roommate, the one where he'd said that his roommate wants to get married and have kids. And I'd said to him, he's not allowed to dupe some woman into marrying him. And I don't by any means think all closeted spouses are intent on deception, but that was a big clue about the intent of my spouse at the time. I've had no contact with him since our divorce and no plans to have contact with him. All of my own closure and healing has taken place through my own effort and my own extensive therapy and all of that. And I would have to say that I've mostly forgiven him. And so I'm at a really lovely, beautiful place in my life, and I'm able to give back to other straight spouses as well. I work with the straight spouse community, and I'm on the board of the Straight Spouse Network, and I'm also an LGBTQ ally unapologetically. So
you didn't have any children?
We did not. And I'm very grateful for that we ended up not having children. Yeah, that was a blessing.
Did he have children with his second wife?
He did not have children with her, but she had a 2-year-old daughter when they married, who became then his stepdaughter for a period of 8 years. So he raised her as a stepdaughter from the ages of 2 to the ages of 10. And I do know that the dissolution of the second marriage was very hard on his stepdaughter.
Is there anything else about your personal story that you want to share before we talk more about Straight Spouses Network?
The hardest things for me to forgive my ex-husband for were not that he was gay, and not even that he was closeted, but that he didn't let me go to find a fulfilling and loving and passionate and mutually affectionate relationship, which I'm in one now, which is amazing. But that at no point, did he ask, is this fair to her? Or if he did ask himself that, he still came to the conclusion that he wanted to stay in the marriage. And in fact, I have pretty good information from the second wife that had I not initiated the implosion of our marriage, he would have kept going until potentially he came out to me. So he was in his 40s, early 40s, when he eventually came out, which midlife seems to present, midlife has presented all sorts of identity issues for me, not even sexuality wise, but that seems to be when some of our authenticity comes home to roost, and we as people have to confront it and decide if we're going to live authentically, if we haven't up until midlife. I may just as well have been the wife that he'd come out to had I not left sooner. So that is the hardest thing to forgive, that he did not let me go. And the other thing that I found really difficult to give is that I really did experience it as a violation of my informed consent. I did not get a chance to say, yes, I want to be in a mixed orientation marriage. Yes, I'm okay with that. Now I realize not everybody, he may have very well been struggling, grappling with questioning his sexuality in deep denial, but I believe he knew enough to know he was questioning when we were engaged. The signs point in that direction, and some of the comments and conversations that we had. And, the burden really wasn't on me to interpret his clues. The burden was on him to disclose what he knew at the time. In the Me Too era, when we talk about consent a lot, I really did experience that as a violation of my consent and my informed consent. And the chance to make my own decisions about my own life, where my agency, my personal sovereignty, my ability to direct and decide what I want for my own life. It would have been a bit of a different thing if I'd said, well, I don't care if you're gay, we're best friends, and I don't really need sex, and sex is not important to me, and I just want to be with you. And if I'd made that choice and even found out later on down the road that, okay, this doesn't work out like I thought it was going to work out, at least I would be able to say, I got to make the choice.
Well, that seems fair.
Yeah.
So tell me about how the Straight Spouses Network came about.
Well, the Straight Spouse Network was founded in 1993 by a woman named Amity Pierce Buxton, who is still with us in her 90s and still incredibly feisty. And she founded it as a peer-to-peer support group for people who find out that their partners and spouses are LGBT. At the time, straight spouse is kind of limiting today because we talk to people who are the cisgendered spouses of trans people. People find out that their spouses are bisexual or queer in other ways as well. And so while the predominant majority of us are straight, consider ourselves heterosexual, and the majority of those spouses are women, we have a mix of people. And we are, as an organization, LGBTQ affirmative. We have a 3-pronged mission, which is supporting straight spouses, reaching out to other organizations to build understanding and awareness, and educating about the straight spouse experience and what it's like to be on this side of the closet. We really believe, in Amity's words, that we're victims of homophobia too. Or we've experienced the consequences of homophobia too. And we'd love for our organization not to need to exist one day. We would love for no one to feel like they need to be in a closeted marriage, or to be in a closet and to have a marriage as part of that closet. That would be a great day as far as we're concerned. And so the network is actually all over the country, and then also in we have legs in other countries as well, Great Britain, Australia, and we have peer-to-peer support groups in certain regions in the country. And then also we have a phone triage system, and we lately have been getting around, we might get 150 to 180 or so calls for help a month from people who have either been disclosed to by their spouse, or they've discovered or found something. What do I mean? I found gay porn. What does this mean? I found this text message exchange between my wife and another woman. What does this mean? That kind of thing. So it can be an intense time, those initial moments when you have been disclosed to or when you discover. So we pride ourselves on being there in that intense crisis moment.
Would you be really clear for me about what the 3 prongs are?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's providing support to straight and cisgender spouses primarily. And I will say this, occasionally, sometimes people question their own sexuality after this experience. That happens as well. So not everybody who's a straight spouse would consider themselves necessarily 100% straight after this too. So providing support, peer-to-peer support, is number 1. Number 2 is reaching out to other organizations to build bridges. And primarily those other organizations are like PFLAG was our initial source of funding came through PFLAG. So we used to, back in the day, have a very really wonderful relationship with them. And then the third is educating the general public at large about the straight spouse experience and how it is related to homophobia, how we absolutely are casualties in a homophobic and queerphobic society as well. And our stories are important and valid and need hearing.
So there's like the stigma of having been married to a gay person.
We often say, our spouses come out of the closet and we go in because it can be humiliating in that oftentimes other people may question, well, didn't you know? How could you have not? Well, I just heard this very recently. Well, I always thought he was gay. Not helpful. Like I heard this from a relative, and you're already asking yourself that. You're already combing over your entire life going, how did I miss the signs? It's like his second ex-wife messaged me, I'm struggling with how did I miss things? And what people forget is when someone is that intent on hiding a secret or being closeted, they can be really creative about either completely hiding it from you or dangling little bits of information in front of you sometimes if they are trying to avoid coming out but want you to figure it out. It's not on us, and if we're just someone going along in our marriage saying, well, of course I trust my husband, of course I trust my wife, of course I believe what they tell me, then those little red flag moments might not raise enough question. Like me when I was 19 and he said, I figured out that's not what I want. It didn't raise the threshold for me at the time. That's one thing and we often feel like in more progressive communities where there is a lot of support for LGBTQIA people, which is great. But when someone comes out of the closet, it's often congratulations. You're so brave. We're so proud of you. You're amazing for coming out. And the straight spouse is just like, or the cisgender spouse is like, what about me? I mean, my whole existence just imploded in a puff of smoke, and I'm not even sure if my marriage was real. Was any of it a lie? Was it a fraud? Was I a beard? Was I just a bit of set dressing? Like, there's some really ugly and difficult questions that come up. Was I just a prop in somebody's play? And sometimes the answer to that question is yes. Sometimes the answer to that question is no. There was genuine love, affection, maybe not romantic or sexual love, but there is genuine respect and affection in some relationships. Sometimes I do remember listening to one closeted spouse say the reason that he asked his wife to marry him is because she seemed like she was the easiest one to convince. That's not something that goes down really easy when it's 20 years of your life, when it's 30 years of your life, when, after 40 years of marriage, your husband comes out and tells you he's gay and he wants a divorce and you're going, wait, we've got 3 kids and 12 grandkids. And, it's hard to look at your entire life and think, oh my gosh, was all of it a lie? Or was all of it a waste? Or was I a fool for all of it? So there's a whole questioning that happens in secret and a grappling with the feelings of either shame or anger or even rage. If you feel like your whole life has been commandeered for someone else's show, and none of those feelings necessarily have anything to do with homophobia. So that's the other thing is that we oftentimes get confronted with if there's anger or rage. Straight spouses are very often told that they're bitter. They're very often told that they are homophobic. Very often told, why can't you just be happy for him? He's his true self now, or she's her true self now, which if you're not in the marriage, of course you might be able to be happy for that person for finding their own authenticity and being able to express it. But if you were the one who was in the marriage with them and you thought they were being authentic or took for granted that they were being authentic with you the whole time and you find out they're not, that's another ball game. From my experience working with straight spouses, it takes longer and sometimes orders of magnitude longer to heal and recover from these kinds of divorces. So, and especially if the straight spouse's anger and frustration and sense of loss and sense of theft goes invalidated or unacknowledged, that's an extra wounding on top. And then if you add to that you have children together and you have to figure out how to co-parent and with a person who you feel has maybe, and this is, I'm going to say this is really harsh, and I want to say very clearly, not every straight spouse feels this way, but some do, that if you have been used as for children, if you were there to provide the wife, the family, the marriage, the white picket fence, the 2.5 kids, and you may not regret that you have your wonderful children, but some people are going to look at that and go, was I just a sperm donor or was I just a broodmare? And those are really ugly, harsh feelings that have to be grappled with. And we don't always get the space that we need to grapple with those questions without being called homophobic.
Yeah, I have to admit that before we started corresponding, I had never really thought very much about your side of the story. And I'm sure that that is true for a lot of us. My sample is pretty small. Most of the people that I know that are trying to come out are struggling with, how to be honest. And these are people who have just realized it's not like they were pretending for many years. I think that's much more common for women than men. The men tend to be the ones that are trying to push it down for many years, whereas as women, we tend to be, oh, okay. If you listen to my last episode, it was actually about a book that a woman wrote about why women figure it out later than men. But anyway, so I really appreciate you bringing this other point of view, and that's why I wanted to share this. You mentioned that you've got mostly women, and I think that sort of fits with what we just talked about. What's the biggest difference between men and women in the people that you work with?
Do you mean like how men handle it versus how women handle it, or what a difference between their experiences?
Difference between their experiences.
Well, I think that that's true, that one of the things, because there is this idea of sexual fluidity, which seems to have more permission in women in the society currently, that oftentimes the men who experience this can be really invalidated because, well, if it's an idea of a woman discovers late in life that she's really attracted to women and that she's really a lesbian and that women are sexually more fluid, et cetera, that he should just be okay with that. That he should be okay with losing his wife or the breaking up of the marriage or et cetera. Or that he should think it's sexy that his wife is attracted to women. Because, in the pornification of America, one of the popular porn genres is girl on girl porn. And so guys will get things from other guys like, dude, that's hot. You know what I mean? And he's like, this is my wife. This is my family. Women are not expected necessarily to roll with their husbands being gay or have comments made like, well, maybe you can have a threesome with another guy or something like that. Unfortunately, because that is the case, sometimes the male husbands have their experiences invalidated in a different way. But there are similarities too, in that some of the things that husbands are told, for example, like when the closeted spouse is not sexually interested in their heterosexual partner, right? Sometimes excuses or sometimes deflections can be made to try and avoid the bedroom, right? And so men hear things like, I feel like you're attacking me. I feel like you're preying on me. I feel like you are raping me when you want to have sex with me. And that is a tremendous sexual shaming that those husbands then have to, oh my God, if you're a man of conscience, the last thing you want to be is have a predatory sexuality in this culture. The women might hear things like, you're too fat, and that's why I don't want to have sex with you. You're ugly, that kind of thing. So that then has repercussions for the straight spouse's sexuality. That then has repercussions for where we have to recover, and then forming relationships and trust and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and sexually vulnerable with new partners going forward is a tall ask after that shaming.
I want to break in here for a moment to ask you for your help. I started Graying Rainbows in November 2018, and I think that one of the most important lessons I've learned so far is the power of personal stories. I need your help to find these stories. You can send me suggestions for guests, or if you're ready to share your own story, that would be even better. Just email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Oh, and also you can help support this show via Patreon at patreon.com/Graying Rainbows. So do you have advice for the late in life person who doesn't want to hurt their spouse any more than can't be avoided, I guess I should say?
So I've got a couple things that I think will be sort of practical, and then a couple things that I think will be sort of more philosophical. And one of my recent episodes of my own podcast, I interviewed William Dameron, who was the author of The Lie, which was basically his story of being a closeted husband in a 20-year marriage. When he was getting to the point where he was ready to come out, that moment of just bursting. I can't stay where I am, but I can't move forward, right? Like if I come out to my wife, I will betray her because our family is going to fall apart. But if I don't come out to her, I will also betray her because I'm not telling her the truth. And he's stuck between this rock and a hard place. And the thing I said to him at the time was, I have empathy for being between that rock and a hard place. What gets lost in that calculus is the straight spouse's own sovereign agency to decide for themselves what kind of marriage they want to be in. The best that we have at any given moment when we're in a relationship with somebody else is to simply tell the truth about who we are and where we are and what we are. And then the other person gets to decide, I can meet you there or I can't. That, of course, is a lot harder when you have somebody you have a history with who might feel like you've been lying to them the whole time. So my advice on that one is, when you do decide to disclose, when you do decide to tell the truth of who you are and what you are, be prepared to allow your straight spouse or your partner to have the dignity of their reaction. They may be rage-filled. They may be brokenhearted. They may be confused. They may want to know if the whole marriage was a fraud. They may want to know if you ever really loved them. They may comb back through every memory of the proposal and the wedding night, and they're going to be up to this project for a long time. And I want to make this caveat. I am very sensitive to when you disclose that, if you're physically in danger or you feel that the disclosure is going to result in some kind of physical harm or abuse. Well, this is another category, and we're talking about safety issues and things like that. That's not what I'm speaking about here. And so we can deal with someone else's anger. And we need to allow the straight spouse have the dignity of their anger or heartbroken or frustrated response, and then have the dignity of asking those questions. One of the things I call her my sister wife, the woman who was married to my same husband, had said to me that was very difficult was he came out to her on cue cards, and then she collapsed on the floor, and then he walked over her and left the house. So she was like, I couldn't ask him any questions. She said, I could. And for weeks and months afterwards, he would not allow me to ask questions. I'm not saying that, you need to if there's been infidelity or an affair or something like that, that you need to divulge every nitty-gritty detail of that. But your spouse may want to know, when did you first have feelings for the same sex? Or when did you first start to question your sexuality? Did you know before you married me? Why did you marry me? They're going to be able to tell if you're lying or gaslighting them. This is the time for real honesty. This is the time for, as painful as it's going to be, it will help the straight spouse heal that much more faster if we do not put lies on top of lies or gaslighting on top of gaslighting. And the thing about gaslighting is I've come to really realize that my ex-husband maybe didn't intend to gaslight me, but he did every day of our lives. And that is a form of psychological abuse, intentional or not, and one that took me years to recover, because what gaslighting does is it undermines your sense of who you are and how you can trust yourself. Like you no longer feel like you can trust your own intuition, right? And that's a long recovery process. So if we can take the gaslighting off of the table for any reason whatsoever, whether it's usually unconscious, right? I'm trying not to get found out. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's absolutely intended.
Well, for the sake of my older listeners, would you define what gaslighting is?
Absolutely. So there's an old black and white film. I think 1932 is the film. And I want to say Ingrid Bergman. Ingmar was her father, was in it. And the idea was that she married this man who wanted to get his hands on her fortune. And so he decided he wanted to convince her to go insane. So the way he did that was he made the gas lights flicker in the house. And every time he left, so he'd leave the house and she'd be home alone, and the flame and the gas lights would flicker, and he'd come back and she would say, the gas lights, something's wrong with the gas lights. And he'd be like, you're crazy. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm glad you brought this up, because if there was ever a moment in your marriage, in your 20 or 30 or 40-year marriage, where your spouse came to you and said, something's off here. I'm really sensing something's not right. Would you talk to me about it? And you said to them, you know what? You're crazy, or you don't know what you're talking about, or nothing's off. Everything's fine. But you knew better. That was when you gaslighted your spouse. And I'm just going to say this very frankly, you owe an apology for that. Because when you gaslight somebody, you're telling them not to trust their own reality. You're training them not to trust their intuition. You're training them not to trust their intuition and their guts. And that is a form of psychological abuse. And if it's done repeatedly over the years in the interest of keeping a closet, keeping a secret, that's a lot of damage that it has to be apologized for and atoned for. And a lot of times what happens when the gay spouse comes out, another thing that we often deal with is oftentimes, and I understand this, the gay spouse comes out and then, oh my God, it's like a weight has lifted. I can finally be myself.
But you threw it over on them.
Right. We're wearing the weight now. And so it can be very hard for straight spouses to watch their LGBT spouse move on very quickly with a partner of the same sex. And people say, well, it shouldn't be any different than if they move on quickly with a partner of an opposite sex, right? But we're still sorting out who our spouse was on a fundamental level, who they were as a person. It can be really hard to say, I want you to meet my new boyfriend. And you're as the wife going, I'm not ready for any of that yet. It's hard enough for me. I am still trying to wrap my brain around all of what's happened, that you're not the husband I thought you were. We have these milestones that we have to work through. Disclosure or discovery is a milestone that we're working through. The divorce is a milestone we're working through. The first time we see our spouse with a member of the same sex as a partner, romantic partner, is a milestone we're working through. On social media, it can be really hard because all of a sudden our LGBT partner looks like they're living this free and wonderful life and they're getting congratulations and they're getting, you look so happy. And then the straight spouse is going, I'm not sure I'm ever going to trust another human being into my heart again, because I don't know if this person is going to be lying to me about who they are on a fundamental level. There is real betrayal trauma here. And so if the straight spouse reacts in anger or rage, I'm not asking an LGBTQ spouse to hang around for abuse, but I am asking an LGBTQ spouse to be present to and hold space for the rage and anger and frustration and questions that the straight spouse legitimately may have. And this is in your interest because if you've got kids together and you're going to be co-parenting for a while, the more you can tell the truth and apologize for the things that you need to apologize for. And no one is saying that the LGBTQ spouse didn't get a raw deal living in a homophobic society. We get that. As a consequence of that, the straight spouse should not have to shoulder all of that burden either. And so I want to say, most of the straight spouses I interact with end up, even if they don't end up reconciling and forging some new friendly relationship with their LGBT spouse, they wind up being LGBT allies because they really do believe that the reason they were in a closet in the first place with their spouse was because of homophobia. So we're trying to, I would say most of us, I'm not going to say you're never going to run into an angry homophobic straight spouse. I would say most of us, at least that I interact with, are trying to, even if wouldn't mind seeing our own spouses trip on the pavement once in a while, we recognize on a broader level that we fight for equality, we want equality, we understand. If there's infidelity, a lot of times one of the other things straight spouses hear is that, well, the LGBT spouse was just trying to figure out their sexuality. And so they get a pass. And that's not true.
It's still infidelity.
Yeah, it's infidelity. And the straight spouse is going to experience that just as they would experience a betrayal trauma of an infidelity. You have to be sensitive to that. If you need a hall pass to figure out your sexuality, you negotiate that on the table. If there's questions coming up, and this is really hard because, again, that straight spouse may go, I'm not here for this. This is not the marriage that I wanted. This is the risk that we take in being in sexual relationships with people. I'm not sure how PG or clean or rated R your show is. I'll keep it clean. But, even just people who not in questions of sexuality, but, I want to try this in the bedroom. I'm realizing that I'm a bit more of a freak than I thought I was when we got married, right? And then your partner goes like, I'm not down for that, right? But we have to negotiate these things. So if you need a hall pass to figure out your sexuality, you negotiate that on the table. Because if you go ahead and give yourself the permission because you think it's better to ask forgiveness than permission of your spouse, but you give yourself permission to go and have a same-sex relationship. That spouse, when they find out, and they're going to find out, and it's not always going to be in really pretty ways, they're going to experience a betrayal trauma. So we're all about reducing the trauma. And as hard as these conversations are to have when you're coming out, the rock bottom line is tell the truth, tell the truth, tell the truth. As basic and core level truth as you could possibly get to. And that means answering hard questions. Well, I thought I might be attracted to women when I was in 6th grade, but I didn't know what it meant. Or I knew I was attracted to men before we got married and I was scared. So I married you anyway. Like, those things are going to be hard for your straight spouse to hear, but they will heal faster knowing the truth. And they may be able to come to a place where you can then have an amicable relationship later on in the interests of co-parenting or even just being friends. But there's, apologies sometimes that straight spouses deserve to hear that don't ever hear. There's this poem by Rupi Kaur, and the poem is 4 lines, and it's very simple. And the poem says, "People go, but how they left always stays." So it's how you come out. And so on the practical side, I'll say this. We have a lot of straight spouses who come and say, they came out on my birthday or a couple days before my birthday. Maybe not on my birthday, but I've heard, we've definitely had some like, gosh, it was just 3 days before my birthday or 3 days before his birthday.
Or your anniversary.
Like, everybody does seem to successfully avoid the Christmas holidays because we do have an influx of straight spouses right in January. It's like, they got through the holidays with the family, with the kids, everything. And then now it's January, everything's back to normal. And then all of a sudden the phone starts ringing off the hook. So everybody does seem to avoid Christmas, but there are other things too. Like, you don't want to come out. I was listening to one story of a straight spouse whose partner came out on vacation when she was cut off from her support system. Oftentimes, if the LGBT spouse is not publicly out yet, okay, not fully out. Maybe they're only out to a couple friends. Maybe they're only out to a couple family. They're not out on social media. They're not out to their broader community, work, church, right? They may ask the straight partner to not out them or tell anybody else about it. Now, no one at the straight spouse, we do not believe in outing other people. That is not at all what we're talking about here. But straight partners need to be able to get support. So you've got to negotiate. They have to be able to tell somebody, a couple people, a therapist, a good friend, someone they can get support from. It is not fair to ask the straight partner not to tell anyone and to live in a closet with you when they are carrying this devastation of what potentially may happen to their marriage while the LGBT spouse is getting comfortable coming out further. So by all means, negotiate. Okay, can you pick 3 people to tell? Your therapist, your best friend, and maybe your mom or your dad or a family member or something like that. This is not the same as maliciously outing somebody. And I want to be really clear about that. The straight spouse deserves and needs emotional and psychological support during this time, and they have a right to get it. And if the LGBT spouse does not agree to that, all kinds of messes happen. Like, we have another saying, it's like, your LGBT spouse has their story and they get to tell it in their time. But we have our story too. And we get to tell our story too. While we don't support outing people, we are all for the straight spouse getting the support they need. The idea is like doing the least damage with how you come out. My ex coming out on cue cards to the second wife, that was something he worked out with his therapist as a good plan. But ultimately, it broke her heart that he couldn't have an actual conversation with her, that he couldn't tell her. The other thing is that my ex, and I'll use him as an example, he told his parents and sisters first before he told his wife. And the thing is like, when you're married, that person is the person you tell first. She ended up feeling like quite the chump, quite the fool. She was humiliated by the fact that she was the last person in their immediate family to know material information about her own marriage. He did tell his parents first and his siblings first so that he could have support, which I understand. But the marriage, once you're married, that's your primary relationship. And so the people who are in the marriage are the ones who need to know first. This is material information about your marriage, and you deserve to know before anybody else. I'm not saying don't tell a therapist, you know what I mean? But be careful who you tell outside of the marriage, especially if your straight partner is going to hear about the fact that somebody else, that Aunt Sally knew before she did. You don't want Aunt Sally knowing before the actual spouse. The how you come out lays the groundwork for how productive and amicable the relationship can be in the future going forward. Your willingness to hold space for anger, for rage, for hard questions, your willingness to hold space. And I'm not talking a couple months. Sometimes this is a years-long process. So it's like buckle up. And like I said, I'm not asking anybody to stick around for abuse. But the straight spouse anger is oftentimes, it is not abuse. It's legitimate anger. I mean, if you've had 20 years of your life or 30 or 40 years of your life that all of a sudden you're not sure if they were real, you're going to be pissed. And rightfully so. So those are my kind of words for the LGBT spouse to kind of help walk their straight partner through this disclosure in a way. And remember, at the end of the day, it's like if you respect someone, how do you treat someone whom you respect? You will be surprised at the level sometimes of disrespect, basic respect that straight spouses have been treated with, because it's almost like I want to get out of the closet. I want the Band-Aid off, and I want to get as far away from that old life as I possibly could, because it was an inauthentic life and it wasn't me. And the thing is the straight spouse is part of that life you're trying to throw off as fast as you can and run as far away from as you can and get as far away from. This is a human being who maybe created children with you, who gave 20 years or 30 years or 40 years of their life as part of your closet. They deserve respect for that. That will help, I think, go a long way to pave the road. And I love it when I hear a story about a new blended family where the two dads over here and the mom and her new partner, or the two moms over here and the dad and his new partner can come together and go to, little Johnny's baseball games. I love it when those stories happen, because it means that there's been a modicum of respect in how the coming out process and then the years of aftermath have been handled, and that the lying and the gaslighting and deception has stopped. That's really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why I was really shocked when I first heard your story, was because it would have never dawned on me to behave that way toward my own husband. I didn't totally come out till after he died, but that was partly because it wasn't because I didn't tell him. I told him long ago, but he never believed me. I mean, I spent 30 years, more than 30 years, thinking I was bisexual, except for the one incident at the very beginning. I was totally faithful to him. To me, I felt disrespected by him because he didn't
believe you.
He didn't believe me. Right. It was like, you could just learn how to do sex better.
Right. And that's a form of denial.
Yeah. And I realized that that's one person's experience. And then some of the women I know, their experience seems to be they're married to little boys and they can't seem to give themselves permission to get a divorce that they would need, not because they're gay, but because the guy that they're married to is a loser. But they feel guilty because they're gay. So because my sample has been so terribly skewed, I really needed you to broaden my perspective.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. And maybe my sample is skewed too, in some regards. But I think that's two separate issues to tease apart. Okay. So the being married to a man-child, I think there are a lot of women, straight, gay, anything, and no disrespect to men, because I love men.
Right.
And, when you find a really good one, you hold on and you're like, wow, I've got a jackpot. He's grown up. But there is the relationship with someone a man who has not fully actualized as a man yet. And that's it's time to cut the cords with that one. Here's the thing I would invite your lesbian listeners to think about is even if those men were completely able to fully participate as a functioning adult in the relationship, your sexuality and his sexuality are not compatible. So the marriage, even if he's an awesome guy who shows up, is fundamentally not compatible. So give yourself permission to get a divorce, to leave the marriage, and free him to go find a woman who is enthusiastic about having sex with him, who loves his body, who loves his masculinity, even if it's a little bit boyish. Hopefully he'll grow up sooner rather than later, but set him free to find a woman who is going to revel in him. Man, child, or no. He has a right to want to pursue that kind of a relationship. Now, not every straight spouse, like I was saying, with my sister wife, sometimes when the straight spouse hears their partner is LGBT, their first response is not like mine, which was like, well, we have to get a divorce because this is not going to work, right? Sometimes a straight spouse will hear that and go, well, we can figure this out. We can make this work. And the LGBT spouse is like, no, I'm already halfway out the door. I need to go be with somebody of my own gender, or, what have you. Or if it's in the case of a transgender spouse, I need to go transition. They're already halfway out the door running. And so the straight spouse is trying to wrap their head around the fact that this marriage is not going to work. There are mixed orientation marriages that do work. Sometimes spouses stay together for financial reasons, especially late in life, and they've made the decision that they're going to go ahead and make a financial arrangement. Sometimes this mixed orientation marriages work because it's a companionate marriage. Dan Savage, the sex podcaster and advice guy, he talks about companionate marriages all the time. Companionate marriage can be wonderful.
That was the case of my marriage, definitely. He was my best friend.
Yeah. And if both parties have all the cards on the table and know exactly what they're choosing, that is legit. And then the other one is the mixed orientation marriage where it's opened up and everybody gets a hall pass. You know what I mean? Where you've negotiated that both partners are free to seek sexual relationships outside of the marriage, or the partners who want to seek sexual relationships outside the marriage have the freedom and permission to do so. And then what are the parameters and guidelines around that? Okay. So maybe we don't bring our dates home to the house where the kids are, or whatever you negotiate there. So mixed orientation marriages, I don't want to say that every single one of them end in divorce. It seems to be that Amity, our founder, has kind of broken down a bit of a statistics. It's like a third will divorce right away. A third will try the mixed orientation marriage thing for a while, and then it'll end up in divorce. And then a third will actually figure out some kind of way to keep the mixed orientation marriage viable going forward. But these relationships take negotiation, they take honesty. There are books out there about open marriages. So if you have a listener who is looking at, I really want a hall pass because I need to figure out my sexuality for sure. Am I bisexual? Bisexuality, oftentimes in the straight experience, is a stepping stone to full lesbian, full gay later on. And sometimes bisexuality is used as an excuse, which is really not cool to actual bisexual people. So for example, my ex-husband had said to my sister wife, well, I was bisexual in the beginning. And I was able to come and say to her, he was never bisexual. I was having sex with him from the beginning. I was rarely having sex with him, but the sex we did have, I can assure you, he was at no point was this man bisexual. So when the bisexuality is used as a deflection or to say, well, I was sort of kind of attracted to you a little bit in the beginning, let's just be honest about that. As hard as it is to hear, I was never attracted to you, you need to deliver that message with a lot of care and a lot of respect. But you need to give the straight partner a lot of truth. Because when you don't know what your own narrative history is, it's very difficult to trust yourself to build a new life going forward. Because you're not sure you're going to repeat. For 8 years, I didn't know if I was going to repeat my marriage or not, because I didn't actually know what really went wrong in the marriage. So I had sexual partners, but I didn't have relationships because there was no way I was going to open up myself to trust another person to come into my life. We have to be sensitive to the fact that the cookie can break in all kinds of different ways, and that there's going to be unique damage done to individuals that are going to have a long healing process. It can be psychological damage. There's some research, a woman named Kimberly Brooks Mazzella, a psychologist or a counselor, she's with the Straightforward Project, has done some survey research, and the indication shows that straight spouses have issues with mental health long past when regular, quote unquote, normal divorces might, straight spouses will have issues with depression, PTSD, anxiety, well post when a normal divorce might resolve those mental health issues, because again, the gaslighting often can, if it's been over a long period of time for many years, a cumulative effect can result in complex post-traumatic stress. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I want to say that. But from my own experience and from the experience of multitudes of other straights who were, gaslighted on a daily basis, that has real psychological and mental health effects. And that can't be discounted or dismissed or invalidated. So that's really important to note too. Your spouse may be really struggling with depression after this divorce that just seems out of all proportion. Like it was just a divorce, right? Well, no, their reality was upended and they're combing through every date, every anniversary, every Christmas, every holiday, every time you got a card, they got a card that said, I love you on it. They're going through all of those, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. And that's a psychological hurdle to get through.
So to sum up the two key ideas that I hear you saying is honesty, 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 and give your spouse room to feel whatever they feel.
Yes. Tell the truth, tell the truth, tell the truth. As honest with yourself and with them as you can possibly be. And then allow their spouse the dignity of their reaction. Hold space for their reaction. If you can hold space and actually even witness it, nobody likes to feel like someone is mad at them. It's one of the most uncomfortable feelings we can possibly have as a human being, is to feel that somebody is mad, and especially somebody's enraged with us and somebody is really pissed. And what's even worse is if it's justifiably so. Okay. And the first thing we want to do is go, it's not my fault. I did it because of this. I did it because of this. I did it because, if you can hold with it's not my fault and here's why, don't be mad at me, blah, 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 and just hold space for their reaction, for them to have the blow up, have the anger, have the rage, have the heartbreak, have the meltdown, have all of that, and make sure that they're supported with a therapist and a family member and a friend. And you don't necessarily have to be that main support, and it may not even be the best idea for you to be that main support person, but you have cared enough to make sure that they are supported in those moments post-disclosure. They will know eventually, okay, he didn't just leave me hanging. She didn't just leave me there broken on the floor. She told me, and she said, when you're ready to talk, I'll answer your questions. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's great. Anything else?
I don't think so. I think that this is so fantastic, actually, that you're reaching out, and we reached out to each other. I'm not sure how, I don't remember how it happened, but that we're having this conversation because this is important for families. It's hard enough to get through a divorce. It's hard enough to get through parents breaking up. It's hard for even, if there's small kids in the home, it's hard when there's adult kids to see their parents breaking up. And so anything we can do as families to facilitate people treating each other with respect, even in these really hard times, I think that's great.
And then probably they might also want to share your podcast.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, thank you.
The name of your podcast is?
It is the Straight Spouse Voices podcast. You can find it on Apple, iTunes, iHeartRadio. If you go into the search bar and just type like Straight Spouse or Straight Spouses or Straight Spouse Network, you should be able to find the podcast. We interview mostly straight spouses. Occasionally, we interview the LGBT partner for their perspective. We interview some trans spouses and some cisgender spouses as well. We're about to have a woman on in a few weeks whose partner is asexual, and what that experience has been like with her, for her. So we're trying to kind of get as many diverse voices as we possibly can on the podcast, with the priority focus being on the straight partner or the cisgendered partner, because our voices are the ones that often get lost in the shuffle. And they can also go to our main webpage, which is straightspouse.org. And on the right, there's a link to the podcast down there. So you can find it there as well.
Well, Kristin, I really appreciate this. This has been really powerful. I know that my listeners are going to, I don't think enjoy is probably the right word to use.
I don't think enjoy.
But I think it's going to help people.
I'm so glad. And thank you for doing this and bringing this to them. And know that I'm an LGBT ally, unapologetically. I was in theater in high school. So it's like, of course, all my best friends were gay, so we're here. We understand. We know that this has not been an easy journey for you either. And so we're just asking that you acknowledge just when it's going to get easier for you, it's going to start to get harder for us.
So maybe we can learn to be in it together.
Yes, I think so.
I want to thank Kristin Kalbli from the Straight Spouses Network for taking the time both to share her story and to give us a really valuable perspective. She made several points that I think are worth repeating. Straight and cisgendered spouses may face a long road to their own healing, but rather than being able to work through their natural feelings of anger and betrayal, they often get accused of homophobia. Another point she made was that it's not the responsibility of the straight or cis spouse to figure things out based on clues or hints. After all, marriage is supposed to be based on trust. To be honest, I never considered how much damage could be done by not telling the truth. Many of us worry about hurting our spouse by coming out to them without thinking about their point of view of not knowing what's really going on. Lastly, we come to a theme that has appeared in almost every story over the past year. Healing takes time. If you tell your spouse that you're LGBT+, expect them to have a strong emotional reaction. They can't skip straight to acceptance. If you can give them room to feel whatever they feel, and you can be compassionate, including having the courage to answer their hard questions, then there's a better chance of having a healthy relationship in the future. I would love to hear your feedback about this episode, and I hope you'll share it with others. You can email me at grainrainbows@gmail.com, submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/DocArtemis, or post to the Grain Rainbows Facebook fan page. Of course, don't forget to visit our website, grainrainbows.com, and subscribe to Grain Rainbows for free in your favorite podcasting app. As I mentioned during the interview, I'm always looking for people who are willing to share their stories. I know from personal experience the power that comes from being able to share. But the best part is by sharing your story, you'll be able to help others feel less alone. If you're interested in doing this, just email me at grainrainbows@gmail.com. Also, if you're at the point where you would rather share in a more private way, consider joining our private Facebook group. All you have to do is go to the public Grain Rainbows fan page on Facebook and click on the link at the right. And when you request to join the private group, you'll need to answer a few questions. This is to protect the other members of the group. You also need to be at least 30 years old. On Facebook, private means that the posts are visible only to other members, but membership is publicly visible. So if you're at a stage where that would be a problem, just email me so I can help you find a private group that fits your needs. I also want to take a moment to give a shout out to Midge Noble for her day-to-day management of our private Facebook group. She was my guest back in episode 21, and if you're new to the show, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to her interview. One other thing I keep forgetting to mention is that you can help support the show financially via Patreon. Basically, that's to help cover expenses such as hosting and especially audio editing. If you're interested in supporting the show, you can pick your own monthly amount. Just go to patreon.com/Grain Rainbows. Moving into 2020, I will continue to release an episode of Grain Rainbows on the first Monday of every month. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and I look forward to talking with you again next year. Grain Rainbows is copyright Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grainrainbows@gmail.com.